I am so fucked up.
Well, I think that's a good place to start.
Man, I'm just wrecked. I'm totally wrecked. Now I'm having some espresso, which is bound to fuck me up even worse. So that's a good place to start.
Sure, the more we can push the system into disequilibrium, the greater likelihood there is for some kind of emergent threshold to be reached where something productive just might evolve.
Well, there you go. That sums up my entire philosophy on drinking to begin with. I go into that state of disequilibrium in the hopes that something productive will come of it, and sometimes it does. Most often these days, it does not. I was up till about 4:30 in the morning uh, last night, drunk on Facebook under a false identity, harassing people that I don't know, and just having a grand time, but not ultimately very productive. Therapeutic maybe, but not productive.
Well, that's an interesting question. I wonder, if something is therapeutic, whether or not it can be considered productive and vice versa. Does the relationship of causality and correlation go both ways or only one way to the exclusion of the other?
Well, I think if something is therapeutic in some sort of long-term way, then of course it probably more often than not will coincide with what passes for you know productive activity. But goofing around on Facebook, I think that for me at least, there's only short-term gain and short-term therapy, which evaporates almost instantly, or maybe into the middle of the next day. Sometimes before then, I mean, sometimes I wake up and look at the wreckage and see what the hell I was doing the night before, and just oh God, shake my head and wonder how I'm going to pick up the pieces. But I don't think it's a successful long-term strategy because people on Facebook are fucking idiots. I mean, let's face it.
Anonymity can give rise to the worst. But then again, Facebook, in contrast to a lot of other online activity, is explicitly non-anonymous. So the fact that people resort to such jabbering, inane, repetitious nonsense bespeaks the fact that, even though they're attaching their own real life persona to these proceedings, they must seriously undervalue their own identity. It's as if, I would think that if they have their real face and their real name, that some kind of self-interest would come into play in the promotion of their ego.
Well, you probably it sounds like you're speaking from a viewpoint, like a historical viewpoint, as if you were someone who belonged to a culture where shame existed, and shame no longer exists. I mean, you use high technology, magical technology of wonderful Facebook and the internet simply to put up photos of you getting shit faced with your friends at the nightclub, and aren't isn't my life great? And I'm having such a great time. Where's the shame? I mean, if this were still like a genuinely, authentically religious society, people would be scared to death of doing that kind of shit, and they'd be ashamed. I mean, what was it in Afghanistan the other day? Like 17 people were beheaded for attending a dance. I mean, that
Is that
story
right?
was in the news. Yeah. So, I mean, they had they actually committed no crime other than that they were at this public dance, and some of the, I guess, more serious-minded members of the Taliban decided to snatch them and then chop their heads off for
Believe it or not, in Iraq recently, I've heard people have been put to death for being emo.
I heard that too. Well, that's we can applaud them on that. I mean, there's nothing wrong. That's a conscientious effort on their part. I can get behind that. But the basic dancing thing, I'm not so sure about.
Well, maybe we need to examine the documentary evidence and see whether or not the people were dancing well.
Yeah, it could be like kind of like the Rick James posse. Like these people, they didn't have the proper level of funk. They were just doing a bad job, and the style police came out and said, you fuckers got to go. Heads came off.
Well, in that case, they'd only be making more explicit the silent judge against whom everyone is measuring their actions in any kind of social outing. I mean, the predominant cognitive experience for most people when they're dancing in a public setting is anyone else judging the way I'm dancing? And so, yeah, they could very well just be, it could be therapeutic in that sense. They could be opening up, they could be silencing their inner censor and saying, yes, I am in fact judging you, and in that space of honesty, it's possible for them to be more authentically human.
Well, you make a good point because if you think about it, it's in this kind of domain where Islam really excels. I mean, Christianity, for example, has become too technologically preoccupied. So the real, the real everyday reality of like an Old Testament God is lost to most people. But you see, they keep it alive in Islam by basically the men will stand in for God. They'll stand in for Allah by chopping people's heads off, by, being tyrants in the household, forcing the women to obey. This is what it's all about. You have to be constantly reminded of the terror of the Almighty, and you have to be reminded that life is supposed to be an experience of terror where you're, fearful before God and, you have to obey. But of course, God never appears. So what do? Well, you don't just fold up the religion tent and go home. So somebody has to play God temporarily. And that's where these guys come in. I mean, these people at the dance should have been more fearful. They should have been more fearful of God instead of out there clowning around.
Well, perhaps. I think that we could summarize a good deal of the history of human culture by appealing to the first couple chapters of the book of Genesis, where it says, we have to chase Adam and Eve from the garden, lest they eat of the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil and be as us. And I think that bespeaks something about the human ambition and the trajectory that we're trying to walk in a number of different ways to be as God. And it's interesting to look at how our conception of what God is informs the patterns to which we assimilate ourselves and the potentialities to which we aspire. And it's interesting when people decide to act on behalf of God versus when they decide to surrender to God. It's a question of whether God is my own finite temporal ego, or whether the ego has got to go. The creature must get out so that God can get in, as they say in medieval Christian mysticism.
Well, none of these religions, at least from my perspective, really achieve that. I mean, it's like God is a website. Every one of these websites you go to, particularly when it comes to these paranormal podcast shows and so on, there's the website, and there's a forum or a message board, and whoever runs the website, especially if the person or the people are hosts of a podcast, they establish a tone and a style and certain motifs, and what follows is mimicry. So it's almost as if that founding, starting gesture of saying, this is this, produces like a circumscribed area within which some things are permissible and some are not. So, in the case of a religion, you start off with a certain logical value, whether it's, obey God or God is love or whatever it is. And probably it can't be reduced to a single value, but it could be said that there's a cluster, there's a small constellation of foundational first principles, even if they're not fully explicit or conscious. And then from there, certain things follow, and some do not. And the prohibitions on what must not follow, those are often implicit. So, whenever you have a religion, the fact that anything is being said about it, the fact that it's being transmitted from person to person in some way, invites that kind of limitation. It's a fundamental limitation. I mean, instead of having a person who simply tries to surrender to God and finds the world at every moment occupying the place of God being God, instead you have you have subcultures and you have mimicry and you have, there was an article online not long ago about how scientists are always pushing this kind of thing, but now dolphins are said to have a certain kind of culture. And what they observe is that mainly it centers around tool use. So if a dolphin picks up a certain kind of sponge in its beak and uses that sponge to get food, that act is instantly mimicked by other dolphins. But then, as if aware that their mimicry and their newfound ability set them apart, they start to segregate themselves away from other dolphins who haven't had the chance to learn from them and mimic from them yet. So it's like a detached sphere. It's a detached universe. And religions form these. They form boundaries with what comes outside of them, and websites do, and dolphins do apparently. And obviously, if you associate God with an all of some kind, if God somehow also means totality, well, obviously you can't reach God if you're going through some sort of very circumscribed area.
Well, I think we have to be careful when we begin to criticize the erection of boundaries, because in a very important sense, limitations can be the necessary precondition of freedom. Take the game of checkers, for example. We have the freedom to engage in a meaningful interaction because checkers takes place within a structured set of rules. If we remove the rules and it becomes possible for me to chuck your piece to the other side of the room before you can use it, or for me to turn the board upside down, then rather than having a co-creative, dynamic, and purposive experience, we have chaos. And so it's possible to say, I think, that it's only within a structure of some kind that it's possible to realize the fullness of our potentiality as human beings. Now, I mean, there are two sides to everything. I think that one of the things that we have to realize is that in real life there are very few either or cases. This is either good or it's bad. It's either constructive or destructive. Generally, things are both, and it's a question of how are we going to navigate that multivalence? How are we going to navigate that polypotency in things? Everything is a sword that can cut both ways. Fire can warm or it can burn. Water can nourish and revitalize, or it can drown. So we have religions, we have these structures, we have differentiation. Yeah, I think that the most constructive thing we can do with them is to regard them as a kind of alchemical vessel. If you look at Jung's work on alchemy, he looks back over some of the old alchemical texts and sees in them a metaphor for psychoanalytic theory. And in alchemy, they talk about the alembic. They talk about a vessel into which you'll put the base matter so that it can undergo the transmutation into something higher. And without the vessel, without something to contain the potency and intensity of that transformative process, it can't unfold. Just as, if you pull a caterpillar from its chrysalis, it will die. What will emerge will be something malformed, diseased, and hideous, rather than something complete and structured. So, I think we need to make a distinction between dissociation and differentiation, where dissociation is negative. I am here over and against you, my group is divinely ordained, yours is not. And differentiation, I am studying Kung Fu, you're studying Ninjutsu, they're both efficacious toward different ends, or they're both different means of achieving the same end. So, yeah.
Well, there are two things I'd say to that. And if I can squint through the haze of my hangover, I'll get them out. First off is that I don't think there's any doubt that structure is inevitable and that boundaries are inevitable. So complaining about the sort of primitive structures of subcultures and religions and small groups of people and so on isn't just a naive plea for, structure to be eliminated. And one of the more valuable insights in the key is precisely this, that the supposed tragedy of creation is that, you're in some sort of three-dimensional space or more dimensions. But either way, dimensionality involves structure. They involve certain logical combinations being permissible and others not being permissible. So we live in a structured world, and it's possible to argue that even our concept of a totality, the concept thereof is only possible thanks to limitation and structure and so on. So, we could be appealing to some sort of totality, and yet the concept itself is a kind of fiction in a way that only reflects a prior concept of limitation of some kind. That'd be the first thing I'd say. The second thing is that in regards to alchemy, I mean, it seems to me that one of the more problematic aspects of alchemy is precisely that it presents a reality in which boundaries don't exist. Because obviously you can just transmute lead into gold, or if one thing blends into another and becomes something very different without all of the usual causal steps being followed, and the permissible steps and paths through time and space, well, you're doing something that violates all the rules. I mean, you're doing something that violates the rules of dimensionality, the rules of logical boundary, so on and so forth. Now, that's not to say that alchemy is therefore false, or that any kind of alchemical explanation is false. I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is that if there's any kind of essence to alchemy, you could say the essence of alchemy is precisely that. It's some sort of domain in which None of the usual laws of boundary and time and space and so on hold, and yet there are logical changes, meaningful changes that are discernible to some sort of consciousness.
Well, I think that a crucial distinction we need to make, and that you're drawing out toward the tail end of what you're saying, is that none of the usual rules and dynamics hold. But that is not to say that rules and dynamics don't hold. And it's worth noting that modern science realizes many of the dreams of the alchemists. Consider that it's technically feasible to turn one element into another via neutron bombardment in a particle accelerator. It's possible to create a chimera or a homunculus or any number of fantastical creatures via genetic manipulation. It's possible to create any number of seemingly miraculous scenarios, but they're no longer miraculous. You know, I'm sure you've heard the expression, any sufficiently advanced science is indistinguishable from magic.
Yeah, but indistinguishable to whom? Because obviously the scientists themselves don't regard it as magic because they know the tricks, just like the stage magician knows how he's performing the sleight of hand. So to him, there's no magic involved.
Well,
Yeah,
go ahead.
well, this is the classic response a scientist would give to what you're saying, I think, which is if there are rules, and if the rules are sensible rules, and especially if these rules are rules that have already been identified as sort of defining science and belonging to science, or what we call science, then whatever is under discussion would belong to science. So if you have the theory of the atom and you're doing neutron bombardment and it's timed and the location of the neutrons in space is understood, even if statistically, and the usual rules apply, then to the scientist, of course, nothing alchemical is going on, and they'll be the first to assert that and assert the mastery of science. Of course, to someone from the outside, you're absolutely right. The process seems completely alchemical because you're starting from one sort of logical, meaningful state of affairs, you're ending up in another one, and it's counterintuitive when something like that happens in many cases. So the burden then falls on someone who's trying to define alchemy as something truly independent or separate from science. Well, how is it truly independent and separate from science? How does it avoid scientific capture? Is alchemy only that which we don't have a scientific explanation for yet? Or is there something that's genuinely enduring in alchemy or the alchemical that allows it to resist science?
Well, I think, since we've already, invoked the key, I might as well turn to it as a source of further inspiration for our dialogue. One of the things that stands out to me in that text is that it says there is no supernatural. And yet, the text is replete with entities that we would typically regard as flagrantly supernatural. There are souls, there are angels, there are demons, there is God. And so how is it that a text that can deny the existence of the supernatural can be populated by the cast and characters of theology? And the answer is that rather than what we would usually call supernatural having a separate continuum of principles, rather than it being discontinuous with the world of matter and energy and information, that science is acquainted with. There is only one continuum of nature, and that all these supernatural happenings are simply lesser known potentialities of the natural. Because I think it's also worth bearing in mind that reductive materialism, to a very great extent, is something of a dead metaphor. In the 19th century, it might have been possible to say that something is natural if it's physical, and something is physical if it's endowed with mass, and it's causally connected to changes in its spatial environment, and so on. But quantum physics radically problematizes that sort of attempt to define the natural via the physical, because the category of the physical is elusive, and
yeah. Well, you make a good point about the key in particular with that passage. Well, there's more than one passage, I think, but it is absolutely true that in that book, the idea that there is one creation predominates. I mean, that may be the central idea of the book. But, and this may be what you're saying, I'm not sure, but isn't it true that that too is an argument against the usual? It's not particularly clear whether scientific materialists even understand their own doctrine of materialism. Because as you were right to note, there's been considerable overlap in the past between the notion of the material and the notion of the physical. And obviously, if you look at the word material, it's pretty strongly implied that what we're talking about is matter, things that have mass or matter attached to them, therefore they exist. But in the time that I've looked at the way science reasons, it seemed to me, at least for quite a while now, that what's really at stake in materialism, in the doctrine of materialism, the way scientists typically use it, is that they're really talking about something that exists in time and space. That's at least my considered view on it. There are probably things that scientists, things that they deal with right now in science, and I'm not necessarily talking about anything at the super small quantum level, but I think that scientists in general have very little problem, or would have very little problem, dealing with something that is non-physical, so long as it still existed in time and space, and therefore interacted with other things within time and space. Because really, I mean, the reason why religion, at least Western religion, is the hated enemy of science, or Western science, is because from the point of view of science, religion offers explanations that there's always some agency outside of time and space, and that defeats the whole purpose of scientific reasoning, and it destroys scientific progress from the point of view of these scientists. But again, at the moment, I can't think of a good example to give, but I strongly suspect that there either are things right now that aren't strictly physical, or there are, there could be, I mean, even energy itself. I mean, it has physical effects, but in the sense of the usual idea of what's physical, something solid you can wrap your knuckles on, that sort of thing. Energy isn't physical in that sense, and obviously energy is not matter. If you decide to entertain the opposition that there's energy and there's matter, of course that's questionable. But
I think energy is a good example, because no one really knows what energy is. There's a general concept of the nature of energy that's really more of a mathematical principle, but it's not a description of anything concrete. It's not a description of a mechanism. I think it's telling that a lot of fundamental concepts in the sciences are sort of placeholders. What is energy? What is time? What is space? Which is not to say that there aren't very robust theories on the table for how we could quantify space. What is the smallest unit of space? Whether there's such a thing as the smallest unit of time? Whether space is made of something discrete and tangible. But nevertheless, we've inherited from 19th century physics, from classical physics as a whole, the feeling that it's sort of continuous, that it's kind of cut and dry. But what's happening with materialism is that it's coming undone at the edges. And rather than being a scientific theory proper, reductive materialism is something of an article of faith. It's not even really on the level of metaphysics because there's not a self-conscious, rational argument for it. It's really on the level of ideology. And one of the things that I'd like to put on the table is that reductive materialism cannot be admitted into science, strictly speaking, because any scientific experiment would have to either presuppose the existence of the material world or not. You cannot, by definition, set up a physical experiment that will try to ascertain whether or not physical reality is the bottom line.
No, I think you're absolutely right, because knowledge itself, human knowledge, human thought, and obviously science belongs within that category. It's virtual in a sense. I mean, not only is it relational, self-relational, where everything relies on everything else, so there's no ultimate basis, but it's virtual. I mean, knowledge is virtual. Knowledge itself refutes any doctrine of a real strict materialism that holds that only things that can be perceived by the senses exist, et cetera, because knowledge itself obviously isn't material in that strict sense, and yet knowledge produces the thought that a strict materialism is somehow sensible. I mean, if you mentioned the contrast in a way between mathematical explanations, for example, of energy, and our own linguistic or verbal explanations. We tend to think that our linguistic, our verbal explanations for things like energy and so on are really full of substance when compared to the mathematical explanations, which are purely axiomatic. It's just like it's a proposition that has no foundation anywhere, and it's used for a very strict purpose. But they're really much more similar than we think. But to be clear, let me explain that. I mean, obviously, if you use a set of mathematical expressions to describe energy, for example, you're describing energy in some special specific context, you are trying to explain something that happens, describe it, recreate it, whatever term you want to use. You aren't, I don't know, I mean, anything representational obviously carries an implied purpose. Like if you take a photograph, it's implied that you are trying to show what was in the photograph. If you paint a painting, you're trying to depict or display whatever it was that you painted. Likewise, when it comes to like a set of scientific mathematical equations about some phenomenon, you're doing it for some sort of purpose. But you see, that purpose already kind of circumscribes the limits and the capability of the explanation. I mean, I don't think I'm being clear about this, but you are not offering a kind of non-directed description of the all. You are instead trying to accomplish very specific things with your explanation. I could describe the chemical mechanism in a human skin cell doing a particular thing and totally omit some other process which is right next door to it, because at that particular moment my explanation is really only intended to accomplish a certain set of tasks. Well, by implication, any scientific explanation is always just a partial one. You know, it's been said before that if you really wanted to simulate the universe accurately, with 100% accuracy, you would have to have a computer the size of the universe. In other words, you need the universe itself to have a fully accurate, not partial in some way, you know, representation.
Well, that brings us back to the Borges fable that's quoted at the beginning of Simulacra and Simulation, doesn't it? A map that's so accurate that it's coextensive with the geography that it was ostensibly contrived to chart.
That you're exactly right. And just to, I'm trying to, you know, I feel like I'm rambling a bit, obviously, because I'm so hungover, but that's exactly my point. Representation in general is virtual, and scientific explanations, for example, of energy, are themselves virtual and partial. And when you look at it, our verbal linguistic explanations, which are full of intuitive content and sense content and all sorts of associations that come from being embodied, they are no less virtual and relational, because we use a word like energy, and what does it actually mean? I mean, it's ultimately as non-descriptive as whatever variable, like E, is used in the mathematical expression.
Well, you know, it's interesting to me. Um, it's fascinating how deeply embedded in the Platonic tradition we actually are. Because if you listen to the way we're phrasing what we're saying, it's almost, it seems as though it's almost problematic that you cannot state the definite essence of what something is, you know? And the fact that we have to dance around the absence of an essence shows that we're still very much haunted by the Platonic tradition. The idea that there is some nature, some qualitative origin that's outside of time that we can point at and say, you know what, this is really what it means for something to be an X. But it may very well be, I think that the history of science, and to a very great extent the history of philosophy, is trying to show us that that sort of essentialism isn't ultimately tenable, and that it's holding us back. It's useful as a provisional way of talking, but when we push rationalism to its limit case, we come up with the incompleteness theorem. You know, when we push empiricism to its limit case, we come up with the uncertainty principle. And it reminds me of the key, once again, where it says the essence of reality is not fact, but question.
Well, what's interesting about that, to my mind, when I hear you mention it, is that in a way what he's doing implicitly there is he's orienting reality in experience, because it isn't at all clear, at least from the key, but in general, it isn't at all clear that the universe or creation experiences itself as a question. Now, probably you can instantly make a very interesting case that, yes, the universe constantly discovers itself and reestablishes itself within itself, and so doing, in some sort of temporal context, it is an unfolding question. Okay, that's fine, but if you put that aside, especially given the emphasis on meditation in that book, what the interpretation is that immediately comes to mind is that the human being should be experiencing the world as a question rather than as a fact or set of facts. Although you make a very good point, it occurs to me, regarding uh, the philosophical traditions of antiquity when it comes to this. I mean, any doctrine of essence, when you look at them in Western philosophy in all their different guises, I mean, it's not an original criticism when I say it. I mean, the point's been made now for 100 years, but that, the idea of an essence, some intrinsic thing that makes it special and unique, that very idea is a kind of linguistic byproduct. If you didn't have a name for something, and I think that the school of thought attached with this is nominalism, that the only thing that enables us to believe that something has an intrinsic essence really is the fact that we can give it a name, and that all we end up ultimately discovering that, is unique or intrinsic is the very act of marking it or giving it a name. So in a way, it's a kind of illusion. And you can approach that same issue from the problem of boundaries again, like we started to talk about earlier. It's very problematic trying to separate something from its environment in any kind of conclusive way. I mean, everything is related to everything else, and certainly if you uh, introduce consciousness into the equation, you can say everything is related to consciousness, therefore nothing is absolute. It's relational, which is probably a slightly better way of putting it than relative, at least in this context. But then again, I mean, look at the key. What does he define essence as in the key? He defines it as taste. He doesn't say, well, essence is the capacity for anything to be separated from its environment. He doesn't say it's the ability of anything to be given an algebraic letter or notation. He doesn't say, oh, it's anything that can be logically distinct, considered to be logically distinct. No, he defines it in bodily terms, taste, which is amazing. Again, so essence is an experienced phenomenon without any kind of highfalutin intellectual or rationalist definition. And likewise, when he says the universe is really a question, or the reality of the universe is question, not fact, again, it's kind of oriented in the person, or in the behavior or the practice of the person, seeing it that way.
Well, where all of this leads me is back into Tibetan Buddhism, because in the Indo-Tibetan philosophical tradition, especially following Nagarjuna, the notion of an essence, the notion that anything has an intrinsic nature, is regarded as being the root of all illusion, and the root of all suffering. It's regarded as being the one fundamental misconception out of which all of our other problems as sentient beings arise. Because we think that there is a solitary, independent, and autonomous self that is set over and against its environment. And so that therefore I have to look out for number one. And that I intrinsically exist, and you intrinsically exist, and the difference between us exists intrinsically. And that because of that misconception, I am inclined to deal with you in terms of ill will and greed. I either want to appropriate and control you, that is, greed, or I want to destroy or disempower you, that is, ill will. And there is this triad between ignorance, greed, and hatred, where ignorance is the root of the other two. And the whole thrust of Buddhist philosophy is about critiquing and undermining essences in all of their guises. The essence of the self, the essence of other individuals, the essence of phenomena in general. And that's not nihilism. Saying that they don't have an essence is not to say that they don't exist. What it means for something to be an illusion is not for it to be fake. What it means for something to be an illusion is for it not to exist in the way that you thought that it did.
Well, I've always had real reservations about that term, and I've often wondered whether there's a really regrettable error in translation when it comes to that word illusion in connection with Buddhism. Because you find the slogan everywhere, oh, everything's an illusion, or life is an illusion, Buddhism claims it's an illusion. And in ordinary usage, at least to my mind, illusion suggests falseness. If you say something's an illusion, well, there's some other true set of affairs that's been obscured by it. If I'm thirsty in the desert and I see a mirage of an oasis, turns out to be an illusion. Well, it's an illusion because of that moment of discovery when I realize, oh, this is just a patch of sand. So I think there's probably been a number of unanticipated problems in the West when it comes to people coming to grips with Buddhism just because of that term alone.
Well, I think that the word illusion plays less of a role in Buddhism than it does in, say, Advaita Vedanta, which is a mystical form of Hinduism that began with Shankara and is, popularized in the 60s and has become a major part of our sort of countercultural spiritual landscape. The trouble with the Western appropriation of Buddhism and Taoism and Vedanta and so on is that their terminology tends to be conflated because it sounds sort of similar. So they must all be more or less on the same track. And to an extent that they are, there's a kind of line that you can draw in the sand between Western philosophy and Eastern philosophy. But think for a moment about how distorting it would be to just conflate, subjective idealism and transcendental idealism and absolute idealism and positivism and behaviorism and any number of different things in virtue of some of the similarities that they might seem to have because of the cultural matrix out of which they come. So you can see what a mess that would make on that side, and it makes the
Oh,
symbol.
they do it all the time. They call it Western philosophy, you know?
Well, yeah, but the what I'm getting at is that certain terms from Hinduism get conflated with terms in um, in Buddhism and Taoism, and I think to the detriment of our ability to engage with any of those traditions. And I could go in a very polemical direction here because even some of the people who are trying to popularize these traditions and bring them into dialogue with the West are guilty of this sort of false equivalence. But we'll just set that aside. I do think that illusion is a problematic way of putting it. It is true that our experience of the world is illusory from a Buddhist standpoint, but only in a very specific sense, that we take it to exist inherently. But if it is actually there in its own right, as it appears to be, then when you attempt to get at its essence or nature, you should actually be able to find it, but you can't. You can't find anything that exists in such a solid way. When you delve deep enough into its being, you're finally left in a situation where there's nothing to point at that is the object. There's a simple lack of something separate from the nexus of relations that you can say is its nature. And that's a very specific statement that's different than saying, well, you're plugged into the matrix. Well, it's the dream of Brahman and so on. Because that might devalue the world. It
That's
might,
precisely my problem with it. I mean, if you consider the two terms, um, illusion on the one hand, and then something like hologram. Now, I'm not seriously proposing that everything that was previously translated as illusion now be translated as hologram when it comes to these certain strains of thought where it applies, but just bear with me. So, I mean, obviously, an illusion typically conveys associations of deception, of lying, etc. Whereas a hologram is not a lie. It's not intended as a deception. You know, I mean, if you're looking at the hologram and the holograms used in the original Star Wars movies, I mean, they're not trying to fool you into thinking the person's actually there. You know, if like there's a little miniature hologram of somebody and they're talking to you, obviously it's a representation. It's ephemeral. It's fleeting. You can, like run your hand through it. It has no firm foundation. It's like the wind. It's there and then it's gone. Well, all of that can be the case without trying to convey that creation is a lie, that everything is a quote illusion unquote, that creation should be devalued because everything is emptiness, everything is a lie. And I think, and I'm probably not alone, but I think that there are many people who, if they just rub up against something like Buddhism or whatever specific strain we're talking about, they get that sense, and that's why they reject it out of hand. Because if it's simply a doctrine that claims everything is a lie, you could easily have very good reasons for disagreeing with that. You could even hold that it's not internally consistent because obviously a lie implies a truth. You can't have a negation without a positivity that's negated. But if that's the incorrect interpretation, I think a lot of that would owe to just the translation of the term into illusion.
hmm yeah, it's very problematic, and we are dealing with a tradition that if we're only if we're only 100 years, 150 years into the dialogue between these traditions and the Western tradition, then we're at a very young stage. If I want to know what was the relationship between Hobbes and Descartes? I can pick up an encyclopedia and I can find out, oh, well, they corresponded with each other, and Hobbes didn't quite understand Descartes, and it's all there, in the books. But if I want to know, what is the relationship between, say, Kant and Dharmakirti, or between Nagarjuna and Derrida? Tough luck. There's literature. There's even very good literature, but you'll probably end up having to figure it out for yourself. And people are still in the process of trying to figure out exactly how to translate some of the key terms. One of the central concepts in Buddhism is interdependence, and you could find that rendered any number of different ways, as relativity, as dependent origination. You could go from one book to another, and depending on the skill of the translator, you might not even be aware at first that they're talking about the same concept. So it's very young, but all of this might be neither here nor there. For our present purposes. It actually has occurred to me that the concept of a hologram really does get at the essence of what they're trying to say here. Because there is a flip side of emptiness, and that's dependent origination, interdependence, relativity. That things arise in dependence upon causes and conditions, in terms of the reciprocal interaction between parts and wholes, and between subjects and objects. Nothing exists from its own side apart from the matrix of relationality. In the words of the Venerable Thich Nhat Hanh, we inter-are and can only inter-be. What do I mean? Take a dollar bill, and this is an example that gets floated around in some of the texts about Buddhism. Take a dollar bill. A dollar bill exists only because of causes and conditions. The United States economy, for example. Parts. So the ink, the molecules, and so on, the printing press, the trees that were cut down for the sake of the bill, and thought. It only has value as a unit of currency inasmuch as you attribute that value to it, in as much as you exist within a system. So interdependence is the flip side of emptiness. Interdependence is a positive concept. Emptiness is a negative concept. They're mirror images of one another. And the way to get at emptiness is via interdependence. But it's not saying that there's nothing there. It's only saying that what is there arises only sensitively upon a delicate lattice of relationships.
Well, I mean, I see it in a slightly different way, and tell me whether this makes sense or has any value or not. If you encounter the world non-critically, in other words, if you're not attempting to contemplate creation as a totality or in any kind of fundamental way, you're just living through the world, you're embedded in it, you're inside the whole cycle of causality without ever considering it as such, and therefore without ever considering it in terms of its own boundaries. And what ends up happening if you, I suppose, if you pursue this particular Buddhist path, or if you pursue a life of contemplation, some other tradition, when you're contemplating creation as such, by trying to understand it, even partially, or maybe understand is too strong a word, but by even considering it as a thing, by implication, boundaries are created. And if you're, in particular, ascribing to what you see and what you consider to be the world these characteristics of interrelationality and so on and so forth, you can't help but realize that since this is all a sort of closed order, that surrounding that order is emptiness. In other words, if there is a creation, quote unquote, and it exists as such, well, then there's an outside to it. Particularly if you're looking at the question as one of basis or foundation, if you're looking for the basis of creation or the foundation, or for example, essence again, something foundational, as soon as you perceive interrelationality as being the basic nature of things, then it's possible to imagine this whole thing as a closed causal circuit where everything's relating to everything else, but there is an outside, and that outside is just emptiness. There's no bottom foundation in some deeper truth. You just have, what is, and what's outside of it. Now it's genuinely really nothing. That's how I would conceive of emptiness in the context of what we're saying, given the term and given what we've said so far.
Well, the way I think we need to begin critiquing that is we have to be careful not to appropriate the word emptiness as something analogous to, say, the Newtonian conception of space, a kind of blank backdrop within which phenomena are occurring. Emptiness is not nothing. It's an absence of a specific property. And in fact, you could say that emptiness is a property of persons and things. Phenomena have this characteristic that you can't pin down their nature. Everything has its own emptiness. There is the emptiness of the chair that I'm sitting in. There's the emptiness of the devices that we're using to have this conversation. And importantly, there's no such thing as emptiness. You find emptiness when you try to find the essence of the table, or let's take an example. Let's take an example from Richard Rorty. What's the essence of the number 7? Well, 7 is 21 divided by 3. It's 6 plus 1. It's 14 divided by 2. The essence of the number 7 is the rest of the number line. So if you try to find your own nature, you end up coming up with what they call in Tibetan logic a non-implicative negative, a simple lack, right? And if I try to find the essence of the table, I'll hit the same deal. Now, if I try to find emptiness, what I'll find is the emptiness of emptiness, because emptiness, too, is a concept. It's not a kind of cosmic backdrop. It's not a kind of space within which things are occurring. It's a property of phenomena. And it's the most salient property that we can abstract from them, because it's this property that allows us to undo our habitual way of seeing things, which keeps us kind of trapped and suffering.
Well, as a doctrinal matter, that may be so. And I accept your definition of emptiness as being kind of like the property of non-essence. But I think it's possible to run up against this other concept of emptiness, just to use the same term, hopefully without introducing too much confusion, when you consider it strictly from the point of view of relationality again. I think it's possible to encounter a kind of intuition of an outside to everything that is not some sort of static conceptual outside like the Newtonian example, but rather, if you're already considering things in terms of their relations, there is an important way in which saying something has a relation is really kind of like saying it has a property. Now, maybe it's not identical, and maybe there are differences, of course, in what saying one thing will permit you to do versus saying the other. But you are giving some sort of substance to a quote-unquote thing. And I would argue that in a way you are robbing it of some of its emptiness, where emptiness is understood as lack of essence. Even if you define a thing as being a kind of empty sum of all of its relationships to other things, which are themselves empty sums of relationships and so on, you're giving some sort of substance to a thing, even if you're not saying that substance is X, and X is a concept which exists outside of relationship. That's not the case at all. But you are giving it something. I mean, it's kind of odd in a way. You look at it. There's a parallel with like the subatomic particles and so on, which have virtually no mass. You know, in this case, if you define things as being simply a nexus of relations, there again, they're virtually empty, but they're not completely empty.
Well, even in physical terms, we could push the metaphor pretty far in terms of whether things are empty, because the ratio of the distance between a nucleus and an electron is the same kind of ratio as between the sun and, I believe, the outer planets. Or I've heard another metaphor where, if you put an apple in the center of Yankee Stadium, an electron would be a pea somewhere else in the burrows. I'm probably misquoting the baseball analogy, but you get the idea. Particles are themselves mostly empty space, but it gets weirder than that because an electron is an abstract mathematical function. It's not a little physical point that's moving around in space. That's just a metaphor that we use to get a hold of it. If things like wave particle duality are possible, if things like non-locality are possible, then electrons aren't little points, and in like manner, neither are the quarks that make up protons and neutrons. Neither is anything else in this weird pea soup of gluons and neutrinos and bosons and all this other exotic crap down there. So not only is it mostly empty space, but even the things that we define as point particles are themselves abstract mathematical functions. So the whole hologram analogy, and how I'm trying to tie the hologram analogy into the three levels of dependent origination, causes and conditions, parts, and thought, is very literal, strikingly literal, in fact.
Yeah, yeah, it certainly permits that interpretation. I mean, you can carry it quite a distance in the direction of literalism. I mean, you can consider a subatomic particle to be really just a relation or an opportunity for a relation, given that it doesn't really exist in fact, and then chemical compounds combine by sharing or swapping electrons and so on. Well, now you have a relationship which proves, quote unquote, that there's an electron, but at the same time, what's really there? Just the potential for certain kinds of relationships. So I think you could take it pretty far. But there's one thing that, at the risk of bringing the conversation back about 15 to 20 minutes, there's one thing that I would ask you, and that is, now that we've discussed essence to some extent, how would you reconcile that understanding of essence with the one put forward in the key?
Well, if I were going to try to toe the Tibetan Buddhist line, what the master says there is very much like the definition of consciousness. Consciousness is defined as being luminous and cognitive. And what it means when they say luminous is not, like emitting photons. It means that it is aware. in the sense that when consciousness comes to light on something, it's illuminated in the sense of having qualia, which is, more or less how, theorists of consciousness try to distinguish consciousness from other psychological functions. It's qualitative, like what is it like to be? You hear consciousness philosophers talk about. So you might say, that if we say that the essence is taste, it also relates to this in terms of that third level of dependent origination, thought, conceptual imputation, projection, because the essence of it is what we are bringing to bear on it. It's coming from our own perceptual faculties and in interaction with that latest of causes and conditions. And you said that it's making it's internalizing essence. It's bringing it within the scope of the human. But, to generalize that, since we are, after all, talking about a book that is peopled by all kinds of entities, we could say that it's bringing it within the scope of the sentient,
Yeah, I mean, if you look at that line through the lens of the question, what is consciousness? The interesting answer you come up with is that consciousness is the capacity to encounter essence. And given the great deal of emphasis in the book on not only meditation, but specifically imprinting oneself or one's soul with experience, the whole apparatus in the book of quantum mechanics and all the other explanations given with imprinting energetically and so on, that what you end up having there is a consciousness which encounters an essence and is imprinted by it, and in part the strength of the consciousness is determined by how well it can be imprinted and imprint itself. But
well, maybe we could tie it back into the text, because you're referring to where it says the imprinting of essence with experience requires effort and attention. It's the object of all paths and ways to higher consciousness. It is the object of real prayer. To begin, you must meditate. Who does not meditate disintegrates. And I'm reading from it now, because I want to tie this back into the pragmatic, because I imagine that some of the people who could encounter a dialogue like this could say, well, this has gone very far off into left field. These guys have, they've gone up to the top of the ivory tower and they've jumped off, and now they're plummeting into their own self-referential, madness.
Well, fuck them.
Yeah, but maybe so. But if we're going to exercise compassion toward them, I wanted to refer to this passage here, because it brings it back to an injunction, and it might be, I'm also trying to consider the length of time that a typical podcast goes on for, and I'm trying to think about where to bring this to a natural and satisfying close. So when it says that the imprinting of essence with experience requires effort and attention, it is the object of all paths and ways to higher consciousness. It is the object of real prayer. To begin, you must meditate. Who does not meditate disintegrates. It brings all of this mysticism down into something that we can actually engage in for the sake of transforming ourselves. And that is what I think is valuable and distinctive of contemplative traditions like Buddhism, that there are specific injunctions whereby you can verify these things for yourself. You can sit down and engage in it and see, if I do try to find my own essence, will I find that there is not an essence? And if I do find that non-implicative negative, if I do find that simple lack, will it, in fact, liberate me? Will it take away the foundation of greed and hatred, and thereby allow me to transform into a higher kind of being that can ride the waves of the infinite, as it says elsewhere in our root text.
Yeah, but there's an important point of divergence between the book and what you've been describing, because it is pragmatic to the point, I would say, where morality is no longer even a concern. Now, obviously, morality is a great concern to the person who's been called the master of the key in the book. Obviously, the morality is a concern to Whitley Strieber, who's purportedly one of the two in the dialogue. But when we're talking about imprinting a soul with essence, for example, on the one hand, it's clear from the book that that's inevitable. However, whether it's strong enough to allow a soul to hold itself together after death, that's a totally different question. But everybody's imprinted all the time. It says elsewhere in the book that, nothing is lost. Basically, everything is etched into the fabric of memory, the fabric of creation. Nothing is lost. Now, it says elsewhere, of course, for example, that Rembrandt is held up as a kind of exemplar of the direction human beings should be going in, and they should be becoming more complex. They should be able to accommodate more, house more within themselves. But then the question was put, was Rembrandt a saint? And the answer is, forget about it. He was not. So there again, Rembrandt could have been a complete lecher. And it seems very possible that there are people who were complete lechers in the past who spiritually were very advanced. Now, whether their lechery rose to the level of sin is a separate question, or whatever their flaws were, whether they rose to the level of sin is a separate question. Whether that sin held them back from being something more is also still again a separate question. But the pragmatic point of view espoused in that book, The Key, the kind of program that's laid out before the reader, is one that I think is at odds with what you've been talking about as being the Buddhist point of view, to the extent that you have a definition like essence is taste. There's no effort to qualify the experience intellectually, or, for example, to use experience in order to accede to the doctrinal truth of, for example, emptiness. Instead, it says essence is taste. So the implication there is truth is absolute. It may not be universal, but if I'm eating this rich, delicious Boston cream pie, or if I'm in the gas chamber with a can being rolled in, as an example given in the book, those experiences and the essences that I may be privy to at those particular moments are absolutely true. However, there isn't necessarily any universality, because, of course, someone else may be being imprinted differently. And obviously the person rolling the can into the room is being imprinted differently than the person who is the pure victim.
Well, there are a number of different ways that we can take this. And I do believe that the soteriology, the ontology, and the ethics that are put forward in the key are fundamentally compatible with Buddhism. And I think that we could look elsewhere in the Dharma for references to something more similar. And the Buddha can be quoted as saying, just as the great ocean has but one taste, the taste of salt, so my teachings have but one taste, the taste of freedom. And in the Dzogchen and Mahamudra traditions, there's talk about this one taste, and it's something to which one awakens. It's a kind of baseline, qualitative, you might call it an essence, but I'd be getting myself into a doctrinaire contradiction to use that word here. But you do awaken to the one taste of all phenomena, and that is seen as being part and parcel of the phenomenology of liberation. So, I think completely unpacking the apparent contradictions would lead us pretty far afield. So I'm going to have to put a broad gloss on things that deserve more careful attention. And I'm sure these are points to which we'll return in future dialogues. But this idea of one taste, this idea that every sound is the sound of the Dharma, for example, this idea that you awaken to this underlying qualitative substrate is there in the tradition, and it's not seen as contradicting the absence of inherent existence. And let's look now at morality, because the way I read the statement, was Rembrandt to Sate, and he says, forget it, is this. Sainthood carries the connotation of adherence to a moral code, to something that is dogmatic, something that's followed because it's imposed by an authority. And something I think we can draw out in future discussions is the Nietzschean element in The Master of the Key. And I think to some extent there is an implicit criticism of moral codes that are based on authority. And that leads us, there are two distinctions I want to make. One is between renunciation and transmutation, and another is between Western and Buddhist modalities of ethics. So first let's look at renunciation versus transmutation. There's a path of morality that entails renunciation, which is simply not doing what is unethical, what is problematic. And there's a shadow side to that, which is that it can lead to a kind of puritanical self-righteousness. And it's still deeply haunted by the duality between good and evil. Because if you're trying to be pure, you're focused to a very great extent on what is impure. And then there's transmutation, taking the energy of the defilement, taking the energy of the mental afflictions such as pride and passion and so on, and using them as catalysts for awakening. One method is referred to in the tradition as pouring boiling water on a plant to kill it. And the other method is referred to as a peacock coming along to eat the plant. And in their traditional sort of folk belief, a peacock can eat poisonous things and become more colorful because of it. But this transmutation approach also has its shadow side, which is it can be an excuse for lechery, for laziness. There are Buddhist teachers in the 20th century who would show up drunk at a teaching and practically falling off a podium, and the explanation was, well, I'm partaking in the one taste of all phenomena. I'm spontaneously enacting the timeless wisdom that's implicit in all of creation, yada, yada, yada. So the temptation there is to justify one's inaction, potentially. I'm not trying to single out any particular individual, and anyone who's been in the Buddhist world would know the rather prominent individual that I have in mind. But there's a temptation there to justify, to fall back on, well, I'm just transmuting lust, I'm just transmuting pride, etc. So either way you go, there's a challenge that has to be worked with. And I think the way I would read it is that maybe Rembrandt was leaning toward the later form of ethicality. And I don't want to go on for too long, but the other distinction I wanted to draw out is between Western and Eastern conceptions of the ethical. And all the Abrahamic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, have this sense of morality as something that's imposed, and it's something that's given as a contract from God that we have to do in order to receive what we're contractually obligated to get, our entry into the hereafter. But in Buddhism, ethics is seen as, if you do this, you will naturally yield this result. Not because you'll be rewarded, but because this is how it conditions your being. And this, I think, is very much more in line with the key, where we're imprinting essence with experience, and that'll either fruition as our deterioration or our ascension. Karma means that it's like if you sit on the couch, your muscles are going to atrophy if you do nothing but play video games and watch TV. But if you run, you're going to strengthen your heart, you're going to strengthen your lungs, you're going to strengthen your leg muscles, etc. If you're ethical, if you're compassionate, if you're generous, if you're patient, it will condition your being in a way that is conducive to your ascension. So having laid out those distinctions, I think that there's less of an apparent contradiction between Buddhism and the key.
Well, I'm not so sure. I think that the problem really comes down to the fact that in what you're talking about, there's, for example, an essence of the all, but it's implied that only the all has an essence. And again, not using essence in the contradictory way that, for lack of a better term at the moment, is a placeholder. The taste of the all, you could equally say the taste of the all. The idea that it all has one taste, or in the quote that you mentioned from the Buddha, the key holds, I would say, pretty clearly that individual moments of experience have a unique and totally unique essence. That's not to say that phenomena have strict boundaries, or that it's even clear what constitutes an experience. There may not be any kind of hard and fast rules that will lay down and state what constitutes an experience at a given moment. But nevertheless, essence is in effect. I mean, we know this just from the nature of recall. You can look at it in terms of you can look at close encounter experiences in the accounts under hypnosis, for example. The idea is that experience is fragmentary, and that we are experiencing things on all sorts of different levels of consciousness at different times. So we're kind of constantly going in and out of levels of attention and so on and so forth. And at different times, some things imprint us, quote unquote, more than others. Now, the capacity to be imprinted can be increased through work, apparently, according to the key. You can improve your attention over time, improve your ability to be imprinted so that you can carry on after death. But nevertheless, in example after example in that book, he certainly conveys the idea that individual specific experiences contain something essential that is past, even if the thing, quote unquote, being experienced is not clear.
Well, I don't know. I feel I would take it this way. I mean, it is clear that we are always imprinting our essence with experience. But it is also pretty clear, by way of example, that the kind of experience that we're imprinting with matters. And that's where ethics comes in more or less the way that it comes into the Buddhist tradition. Because it gives the example of Nazis in the Holocaust and their experience in the after-death state. And it says that the sort of experience that they have is not going to be conducive toward their ascension, toward their liberation and awakening, but rather it'll be conducive of them falling back into cyclic existence. And that's one example that I think is pretty indicative. This behavior that is characterized by sin, which the text defines as the denial of the right to thrive, causes you to remain trapped in cyclic existence. And it can even lead so far as the destruction of your soul, the kind of petering out of it into the memory of God, into a state that you could call a kind of hell. And in another text that's attributed to the master of the key, of the path, um, Spreber talks about how you could degenerate into the state of being reborn as an animal. And so across the board, we've got a similar after-death cosmology as we encounter in Buddhism, and we find the trajectory of your movement through that cosmology as being propelled by whether the experience you're accumulating is ethical, unethical, or just so empty and devoid of content that you sort of peter out of being. That third possibility is something that is not in the Buddhist tradition as I understand it. But otherwise, I think that there is a strong correspondence.
That's interesting. Well, I don't doubt in the broad sense that there's a strong correspondence. And certainly there's enough thematic overlap and intellectual overlap that we can say that there's quite a lot to say about the relationship between the two, the book and Buddhist traditions. But it occurs to me that one part of the problem is that we're talking about experience and we're talking about essences as fleeting moments of relative strength when it comes to the imprinting of experience, but that remains immune to discussions of ethics and morality and so on. I mean, if you talk about ethics, if you talk about morality, it's possible to say, yes, in the West, you've always dealt with codes that have been imposed, but more fundamentally, you're talking about representations, abstractions and representations. Whenever you deal with any kind of ethics that's conveyed through words, speech, written text, so on and so forth, you're talking about generalizations. So there seems to me to be a real problem when it comes to reconciling a tradition with any kind of pronounced knowledge-based element, like, how you should behave and what constitutes sin and what does not, and what's the appropriate type of action in order to ascend and what is not. Anything like that talks about it in representational terms, and in generalities, is on one side, and on the other side is the actual meditative practice, experience for its own sake, which tries to increase its strength and its longevity and so on. I mean, the key and its discussion of meditation seems to suggest that you only really gain an understanding of what you should do and should not do in life if you cultivate yourself physically, meditatively enough that you have the capacity for real compassion. And it's through this kind of, I mean, intuitive is too weak a word, but it's through direct knowledge of what promotes life and what denies life, gained through this meditative practice, that you are able to continue forward.
Mm-hmm. I think that it's very much in accord. Yeah. And maybe we're past the point in the dialogue where I should be placing emphasis on whether or not there is a parallel and to what extent that parallel exists. So I'll try to switch gears. I feel like the morality is pragmatic in both cases. Um, the precepts in Buddhism are something that are not handed down from on high, as I've noted. They're something that has to do with the way in which you are conditioning your being. And it reminds me of something out of Socrates, where Socrates turns the question on his interlocutor. Is good good? Someone defines good as what the gods favor, and he says, well, do the gods favor it because it's good, or is it good because they favor it? And I think that that's one of those lines in ancient philosophy that encapsulates a lot of subsequent theory. And in Buddhism, you would say that the Buddha favors it because it's good. It's not good because the Buddha says so. You know, and the same here. You need to have your an intellectually authentic grasp of why you should be compassionate, and you need to practice that in experience. And if you do, you're going in the right direction. And it's strikingly simple in a way.
Well, I still have reservations because anything that involves any kind of set of general rules ends up being imposed from without, to the extent that a particular act or a particular behavior may produce one result in one person and a totally different result in another person. I'm talking spiritually or, in terms of the effect of the soul and in relationship to that person, the person's life, the person's essence, and so on and so forth. Now, if the Buddhism you're describing is wholly without these general rules of how you should act in order to move forward or what you should not do in order to sabotage yourself and so on, if it's totally without any pretense of general rules of conduct, then I would say, well, then it sounds like they're very highly in accord. But if they have any kind of set of rules, then it would indicate to me that there's a divide between it and this other conception of experience and essence that is developed in the key, which is much more particular and very unique and no less relational. But experience and essence as they're presented in the key seem to me to be it's totally impossible to convey them or reduce them to any sort of general rules. And that's part of the reason why I think the Master of the Key is so elusive in his descriptions of them. The idea that you could say essence is taste and offer that as a definition, it's an extremely elusive way to do it. And he's trying to avoid using representations or definitions or codes that will allow a human being to think, the way to this is through knowledge, representation, codes, thinking about it in a particular way, doing certain things, fasting on this particular day, so on and so forth.
Well, the way I would take this up is pretty, I would think it's pretty straightforward. There are precepts in Buddhism, of course. Let's take some of them. The 10 principal non-virtues. Killing, stealing, sexual misconduct, lying, divisive speech, harsh speech, and senseless chatter, covetousness, harmful intent, and wrong views. Okay? Now, it specifically said that the first 7 can be abandoned if there's a compassionate reason to do it. But 99.999% of the time, there's no reason to kill anybody. There's no reason to really steal anything. You don't need to scream at people or talk about nonsense and bullshit. The reason it's the first 7 is because those are acts of body and acts of speech. The last 3 are they pertain to the mind, and there's really no reason to hold wrong views. There's no reason to harbor harmful intent. covetousness is sort of a waste of time. But there is that acknowledgement of pragmatic exceptions. There is this attitude, but yeah, there is this outline. And I think, I feel like this is more agreeable from a secular standpoint than, say, the Ten Commandments. There's nothing about strange gods or, have no other God before me. Don't talk about bullshit. Don't scream at people. Don't, turn people against each other with gossip. Don't steal things. Don't kill people. This is pretty much what we aspire to do almost by default if we're part of any kind of culture. But we'll also violate those things if we believe there to be a reasonably good motivation for doing so. If you're starving, you might steal an apple. There is an attitude that these sort of precepts are training wheels. There are people who really would thrive much better within a structure like that. It's like at the beginning of Thus Spoke Zarathustra. The camel lies down and says, "Put a load on me," and then it shakes the load off, and it's able to slay the dragon named Thou Shalt, and then it's a kind of self-propelled wheel. It's a kind of luminous child. It's a very very memorable passage. I think it bespeaks the journey of the soul very well. But in any case, it's like that. When you have awakened, you don't need those guidelines anymore because you're not inclined to do things that are hurtful, manipulative, and so on. But there are plenty of stories about awakened beings doing things that, would be very questionable otherwise. Padmasambhava, who's the guy who brought Buddhism into Tibet, slit somebody's throat in the street, meeting him for the first time, because he saw precognitively that, if left to go on, this person would cultivate the karma to become a really terrible person, and they'd be reborn in adverse circumstances, and so on and so forth. So there is this attitude that you're talking about, this kind of flexibility. The word that they use is upaya, skillful means. You shouldn't lie in general, but maybe if some kid won't come outside of a burning building, you could lie to them and say, "Hey, look, I've got some candy out here. Why don't you come over?" So there is that flexibility, and there are guidelines. Does that sort of reconcile your concern?
Well, yeah, to some extent. I mean, the tension here between Buddhism as you're describing it and what I talked about a few minutes ago with the kind of problematic aspect of experience is a tension that you could say is in the key also itself, because on the one hand you have living beings being encouraged to meditate, and there's a picture presented in which people are able to imprint themselves with certain kinds of experience which over time provide the promise of life in a truer sense. On the other hand, you also have in the key again and again presented the idea of experience as a construction, experience in a way as a work of art. You have in the key a picture presented of experience from outside time and space having value as such on its own. For example, the fact that the extinction of the human race can still be dealt with in the book in a way that suggests that even if we all die out, that everything that we did for being recorded is still a kind of work of art. It all lives on, and that in some way, from some perspective, perhaps the divine perspective, this all has value. It's one side, it's one pole there. I mean, there's a tension between lived experience by an embodied human being who's trying to cultivate himself or herself. And obviously, there's a problem of sin to the extent that sin is an obstacle to ascension. That's on the one side. On the other hand, you have almost an amorality when it comes to a high enough perspective outside of time and space. I mean, even the total extinction of the human race is, in its own way, a beautiful event. Not necessarily the extinction itself, although perhaps, but I mean the whole human race from start to finish, with a finish, has its own value and its own place and is worthy of its own regard from the proper perspective. So that, too, problematizes any kind of morality or ethics when it's embodied as a set of principles, do's and don'ts, even if they're, to use your word, agreeable or sensible or totally unobjectionable.
Well, I don't know. Does it problematize ethics that a human life can be beautiful if it is a failure? Think about the characters in Shakespeare. Think about Satan and Paradise Lost. Think about figures that are doomed utterly, and yet are are objects of the sublime. They bespeak something eternal. They realize something in their imperfection that reflects the all, like a uniquely angled crystal breaking the spectrum of light open to reveal what is hidden. The fact that the end of the human race is nevertheless seen as constituting a tapestry of living memory that will contribute to the ecstasy of God and to all being doesn't mean that it's not bad. It comes back to a crucial point in Buddhism. Good and bad do exist, but not in the concrete way that they seem to when they're viewed by an afflictive mind. Tragic if humanity should fail, yeah, but it is said that would diminish the consciousness that survives, and it would diminish the experience of the rest of sentient life in the universe.
Well, yeah, I'm not so sure I agree with that interpretation. I mean, I don't wholly disagree. There's nothing that you're saying that is especially false to my mind, but
consider the warning at the end of the text. Don't deny God your ecstasy. Don't make the rest of us wait for you to enter into the kingdom, as it were. And I should throw out there, by way of exposition, for anyone who's not familiar with the text, God, it is said that God wants companions, not supplicants, and that the total aggregate consciousness of the universe, or the original consciousness of which the universe is a manifestation, however you want to take it, is eager for us to reach a level where that consciousness can share in our experience, and we can share in the experience of God. But in any case, at the end of the book, it says, don't make God wait forever. And
well, yeah, but so what? I mean, at the level of human beings rooted in time and space and so on, yes, I mean, these things apply. But what will happen if we fail? I mean, is the universe going to self-destruct? Is God going to commit suicide? There's no suggestion of that in the book at all. So it's a question of what vantage point are you looking at the problem? Obviously, from the embodied, temporally bound human vantage point, We have to ascend, we have to seek the higher, we have to try to achieve or approach the all. But from the point of view of the all is the all no matter what. Now, I'm not saying there's such a complete divide, but we're talking about the two poles here. And there is a middle, obviously someone who is purportedly, an ascended master comes to visit him in the night and tells him all of this and tells him how creation really appears and how it stands because he wants or was told to help. And obviously, according to what you just read, God also wants, God has desires. But that is God as seen or construed from a particular vantage point, which would be one closer to our own. The fact that the book also contains a kind of pathos when it comes to an acceptance when it comes to even massive tragedy. It's there from the beginning to the end. The idea that someone being gassed in the gas chamber might make of that death what a child might make of a moving cloud. Again, there's a kind of ultimate equivalence involved that we're supposed to aspire to, but it's an equivalence that is in its own way absolute. So I think that the worldview, if you want to call it that, the cosmological view put forward in the key, yes, it's full of all these very concrete wants and desires and passions and so on. But there's also the big picture, which is human beings could very well go extinct, and even if they do, it will sing the glory of creation. Now, whether you say it adds to it or not, the text implies that obviously it would be better if we didn't go extinct so we could add to the glory of creation. But when you start considering these things in terms of the infinite, then you run into a conundrum. The creation already is, supposedly, by definition, the site of infinite glory. God is, for example, infinitely patient. God, for example, might be said to be infinitely forgiving. So you have, again, from the outside, everything is infinite, everything is complete, everything is total. From the inside, there are relative degrees. God wants us to do something different. Well, if that's the case, then obviously that's a question of relative degree.
Well, I think that this is a problem that is really going to haunt any kind of mysticism, and in as much as there has to be an interaction between the temporal and the eternal. There are going to be paradoxes of all kinds. There are going to be metaphysical paradoxes. There are going to be ethical paradoxes, because the eternal and the temporal are things that we don't know exactly how to square. But I don't think that the apparent contradiction is a real paradox. It will be sublime if we make it, because it'll be an expression of our victory. But it could be equally sublime if we don't, because it says all life is potentially ecstatic. Whatever does survive will carry the memory of that failure. And the contrast, I suppose, and here's where I'm bringing something to the text that I think is interpretive, the contrast between the failure and the future triumph, the future ascension, the future realization will make that ascension more bittersweet, will make it more touching. Nobody is interested in a story of someone who doesn't start out as an underdog. I feel like there's a kind of interest in dramatic intensity on the part of humanity, who is, quote unquote, weaving a tapestry of living memory, unquote. And also on the part of God. We want a meaningful story. We want a narrative that has overcoming, that has the will to power crashing against rocks of futility, tragedy, loss, only to eventually hurtle through to the other side.
Well, I don't doubt that, but for example, in the text, it said that species do go extinct. Species of intelligent life, conscious life, that presumably have no lesser intrinsic value or worth than humankind. So the fact that that is even possible, that that's a fact, that that occurs, it comes back to the idea promoted in the text that there's only a natural world. Well, there's another association or connotation to natural as well. We're talking about natural also in the sense of life and death. We're talking about wildlife, for example, the collision of life. And when you have a natural world that encompasses both life and death, there is an amorality present even in that. The commonplace notion of the natural world that most people hold, they implicitly recognize there's an amorality. When an animal eats another, attacks another, children are born that are stillborn, that are miscarried, you name it, every kind of calamity that happens with organic life. That alone involves a necessary heavy component of amorality. And when you expand that natural world, even it's still keeping it kind of at the temporal level. If you say, oh, well, we're in this cosmic order where species like human beings evolve, and then if they don't make it, they go extinct. Even at that level, there's an admission of amorality. But most importantly, when it comes to the key, I think what we are dealing with is not the classic set of confusions and paradoxes of theology, where you're right, people try and fail to reconcile the all with the finite or particular, or the temporal with the eternal. The thing about this book is that it gives you a kind of picture of what it's like to have a perspective on the all. In other words, that perspective is not simply one of logical character based on a logical definition. It actually has a kind of character that's distinct and discernible. And for crying out loud, the whole book is an exhortation for us to gain this perspective of the all, that we're not going to survive unless we break through to this perspective. And there are different ways of expressing and looking at it in the book, calling it surrender here, calling it ascension there, so on and so forth. But to me, because of all that, it is very hard to reconcile any kind of conventional moral or ethical system, even ones that are not objectionable, with the fact that there is this kind of perspective, a perspective on the all, which is held by living beings who are not human beings. And this is not just a purely logical perspective. It's one that has character and dimension and feeling to it, and that character, dimension, and feeling will live on regardless of whether humans go extinct or not, just to give one example. And it's also the case that the souls of human beings, outside of time and space apparently, may indirectly be further cultivated by what are considered conventionally immoral or unethical acts. I mean, would Rembrandt have been as great an artist if he weren't such a philanderer? Now, I don't know off the top of my head whether he was a philanderer or not. I suspect he might have been. There are many other cases of artists, as everyone knows, who were complete renegades when it comes to that. And couldn't it be possible that if they had imposed on themselves some sort of self-denial at the beginning, that maybe they would have ruined their own artistic temperament, they wouldn't have developed their capacity to see and to perceive as well, and thereby they deprive themselves of real growth in that regard. They would never have become these bigger, larger people that we understand them to be. Keeping in mind, of course, that there is such a thing as sin in this book, and that it's defined as the denial of the right to thrive. That also is a very slippery definition, which doesn't resemble much that you'd find in a conventional morality or set of moral precepts and so on.
Well, I think that I'm beginning to grasp what you mean when you say amorality present in the text. And I think that in my reading, that's what I've been calling the radical contingency of the text. Because in contrast to any other theological edifice that has an element of teleology in it, as you just noted, it's possible that we won't make it. There's no guarantees. And there are other kinds of radical contingency in there too. Your soul could be destroyed by happening to fall within the blast radius of a thermonuclear explosion. Or your soul could, be enslaved via technological means by nefarious entities from a higher civilization. It says, Strieber asks, well, who's using us this way? And he just say, the master of the key just says, whoever wishes to and can. That is a kind of contingency, a kind of vulnerability that you don't find in Christianity. For example, the new kingdom is going to come. There is, like what Terence McKenna talks about as the transcendental object at the end of history, and it is inexorable, and it is defining the past, and it is pulling us toward it. It's like what Teilhard de Chardin talked about as the omega point. It is inevitable. But there is no inevitability in the key. And I think that that is actually valuable. I think it's valuable because it gives us the necessary condition for the possibility of engaged spirituality. Because I've been around the New Age circuit, and the belief in reincarnation, and the belief that consciousness is evolving and that evolution is a kind of inexorable process that's following this sort of Neoplatonic or Hegelian mode, and it's just going to come. The good will be realized in time. The New Jerusalem will descend from the sky. It is stultifying to people's motivation to cultivate wisdom and compassion. But this radical contingency, what you're talking about as a kind of amorality, can in fact be the root of morality. Now, take it in another direction. Nietzsche says that nature produces an excess of the abortive and the weak. And I don't believe this phrase occurs in the key, but Strieber talks about how the universe is a graveyard of the ruined worlds of intelligent beings. And, the fact of the matter is that there is this amorality in nature. A perfectly beautiful baby bunny can, enter a field for the first time and be snatched up by a hawk right then and there. I think that nature may be immoral, but ethicality belongs to the domain of the sentient. It's what Aristotle might have called second nature. It's an emergent phenomenon that can't be reduced to or derived from the sum of its constituent parts. I think that we can reconcile the apparent theological tension that you're talking about if we fall back on an idea from Buddhism. A lot of the problems in Christianity come out of the fact that God is supposed to be omniscient, omnipotent, and omnibenevolent. But in Buddhism, they say the Buddha is omniscient. And I shouldn't say the Buddha, there are innumerable Buddhas. A Buddha is omniscient, and a Buddha is omnibenevolent, but a Buddha is not omnipotent. There is a limit to their power. And so Buddhism doesn't generate the ethical problems that Christianity does. Well, then why does God allow for evil? You know, the Buddha may know, in principle, know everything and may care in an unlimited way, but cannot save you from yourself and the outcome of your own free will, and cannot save you from your karma. And the God in the key is like that. The God in the key can partake of all being and know it, but it can't save you from yourself and the outcome of your choices. You know, when at the beginning of the text, it talks about the Holocaust and how the Holocaust has led to a chain of events where the child of a murdered Jewish couple who would have solved gravity was not born, and thus we are confined to the planet at a moment when the density of our population is combining with environmental catastrophe in such a way that will doom us. And Strieber asks, well, is this punishment for the Holocaust? You know, too many people and no ability to leave the planet? And the master says, what's happening is, I don't remember exactly, but consequence, not punishment. You know, and if we look at it this way, I think we can get around the apparent contradiction.
I think, I mean, everything you've said has been admirably intelligent, but I think that, at least from my point of view, you've taken a long detour. I think the contradiction is not really a contradiction at all, unless you insist that spiritual engagement, which is I think the term you used, be connected to morality. I mean, if you want to take a perspective here on what's being described in the book that fits perfectly, it would be the perspective of a Nietzsche. The radical contingency that we're talking about, the amorality that we're talking about, I agree with you, provides the occasion for maybe the only authentic spiritual engagement, which you could call amor fati, the love of fate, but fate in the broadest sense, the love of radical contingency, which is perfectly in line with everything that Nietzsche wrote, talking about playfulness and laughter and everything else, the dance. So the idea is for the human being to match creation, to be able to reflect creation in its complexity by saying yes, yes, yes to everything. And that, I think,
not surrender.
That is exactly what I understand to be the meaning of surrender in the key, in the text. But you see, there again, why introduce the third wheel of any kind of moral or ethical system? I mean, this is not to say that the human being becomes immoral or that the human being may engage in sin without consequence. But within the text of the key itself, even morality is given a kind of natural world definition. Because the idea is that the self is an illusion, and if you diminish another person, you're diminishing your quote-unquote self. So it's a kind of almost physical definition of what we would usually try to deal with or treat with, by using moral systems or ethical systems. If you have some sort of direct access to the knowledge, well, not knowledge itself is a bad word in this context, but there's a line in the book where the master of the key supposedly says the barrier between the minds must fall. In other words, for human beings to be able to finally engage in what we would call moral behavior, thoroughly moral behavior, something physical has to change. You have to be able to feel the pain of your brother, not understand it intellectually or not be able to run it through, the computations of a moral system, but actually physically, tangibly feel it. in the same way that ascension, ecstasy, is itself also physically, tangibly felt. So at the level of the text itself, you don't need to go outside. There's no contradiction. You simply have to, right or wrong, you have to fully endorse the natural world, you know, presentation that the book is offering.
Well, I'll jump in here and say that that is very much the attitude in Buddhism. You do have to feel the suffering of other beings. You do want, the idea is that you need to cultivate this attitude called bodhicitta, which is the intention to achieve enlightenment for the sake of all other sentient beings. And what propels that, what motivates that, is your felt sense, your interiorization of the suffering of other living beings. And there are actually exercises. There's an exercise called Tonglen, where you deliberately try to take into yourself the suffering and pain and misery and sorrow of other beings so that you can transmute it and, to fuel your own bodhicitta, but also so that you can send back the energy in a healed fashion. But the parallel that I'm trying to draw out is the fact that that felt sense, that interiorization of the suffering of others is vital. I
You
think
see, that allows for what we would call moral behavior without the need for any kind of moral system.
but you know the value of a moral system, and you have. Let's take the text at its word. When Whitley asks the master, well, what about Buddha? He says, he opened himself to the radiant world and gained its teaching. I should say, I'm quoting here. He opened himself to the radiant world and gained its teaching, which he transmitted accurately. End quote. So if the Buddha is to be regarded as an accurate transmission of the metaphysics that's being alluded to here, then we have to take very seriously the fact that the Buddha and Christ, who is also highly regarded in the text, speak in ethical terms and lay out ethical precepts. But here's the value of an ethical system, as I understand it, and my understanding is really informed by Buddhism anyway. So it's a mirror that you're holding up to yourself, to be honest with yourself. In some of the teachers that I've learned from strongly advocate keeping a log of what you're doing with, say, the 10 non-virtues, or your bodhisattva vows, or the 6 perfections, or whatever. And when you do that, like say every 2 hours, you reflect on killing. Have I protected life? Stealing, sexual misconduct, lying, divisive speech, harsh speech, senseless chatter, and so on. You find that you're more of a schmuck than you thought you were. The value of these precepts, the value of a moral system, is that it's providing a point of contrast between what you could be and what you actually are. And when you take the time to actually monitor, well, yeah, I lied to a bunch of people today, and I, just took this phone that I found in the bathroom, and then I sold it down the street, and this and that and the other thing. It's a mirror holding up to what you might otherwise gloss over, ignore, and forget about. And it's not the 10 Commandments, do this or you'll be thrown into a lake of fire. It's a measure against which you can objectively judge whether you really are doing what is compassionate and wise.
Yeah, I see what you're saying, but I think you can take the comments about Buddha, you can take them at their word, and yet still say, for example, that it's possible for people to find truth by way of error. And even if in very rare cases human beings have ascended let's say the case of Buddha, and let's say that there are others, they've ascended by way of knowledge. When we're talking about mankind as a whole, you have to ask whether morality and ethics as they exist as discourses, as systems of knowledge, whether they have been successful directly creating ascension. And given how immoral everyone is, and given how flagrantly in violation everyone is, in violation of all sorts of different competing and contradictory moral and ethical codes, I think you'd have to conclude that mankind, to the extent that it has ascended, has been ascending on its own, almost by momentum alone. I mean, it's been plodding along. Yes, these moral systems have been important and maybe even necessary, but they not in the way that they think. And again, if you are going to surrender, as we're told to in the key, if you're going to accept this radical contingency, the character of radical contingency of everything that happens in direct moment-to-moment experience, then that is at odds fundamentally, in my view, with any kind of moral or ethical system, because those systems describe life and experience in terms of generalities. They say, you know, thou shalt not steal. Well, compared to Buddhism or other systems, maybe that is too cut and dried, rather, but we know that there are cases where it might be better, quote unquote, to steal. You steal food for a hungry baby, something like that. The problem is not that the Ten Commandments are too strict or that their character is too primitive, but rather any time you try to reduce experience to a set of generalities, you are in some way denying that character of radical contingency. And I think that the reason why human beings don't surrender and why the message of the book is so new is precisely because human beings continue to think that they can get to heaven through the path, the minefield of like moral calculations or ethical systems, even when they seem to be very benign.
Well, you know, it is there it is accommodated for. I have to fall back on Buddhism because it's the system I know best. But you know, if you are being patient and generous and so on, as a part of a rational calculus to yield a certain result, it's not the same by any means as if, you know, there is a kind of spontaneous giving of oneself, like the overflowing cup, the image of the overflowing cup at the beginning of Nietzsche's Zarathustra. You know, it's not supposed to be a kind of cost-benefit analysis. But the thing is, what I'm advocating is that an ethical framework is a kind of Lonely Planet guide to what you might want to bear in mind as you're facing the contingency, as you have to make decisions. Because the fact of the matter is that your untrained inclination is toward sin, toward what the text calls the willful indulgence in imperfection. And while you may learn from failure, the fact remains, you know, it says, you know, it's easier to learn from joy than it is to learn from terrible suffering. And I think in like manner, it might be easier to learn from, you know, trying to adhere to a rudimentary standard of goodness. I'm not talking about, you know, whipping yourself and lying down on a bed of nails. You know, when I talk about, you know, the validity of an ethical system or the helpfulness of an ethical system, I'm advocating something fairly pragmatic.